Hi, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Our mission here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live well in spite of your mental health challenge by sharing insights through interviews, practical tools for living well, encouragement, and courage for overcoming all from a Christian perspective. And now, here's your host, Pastor Brad Hafes.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I'm Brad Hafes, your host. Our purpose here on Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live a faith-filled, rich, and full life in spite of having a mental health diagnosis. Well, today I'm going to interview a friend of mine from Ohio, and he's on the phone today with us, Dr. Steve Grcevich, and he's the president of Key Ministry, and we're going to find out about Key Ministry, as well as he is a new author or has a new book out, and so we want to talk with him about that. So, Steve, I welcome you here to Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
Well, Brad, thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for being so gracious in sharing your platform to help get the word out to the church about some of the tools and resources that are available to help welcome and include and do ministry with families that are impacted by mental illness.
Tell me about kind of your passion, your heart. First of all, I should clarify that Steve is a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, coming from not only a medical knowledge and expertise, but also a real heart for the Lord and for the faith and living out our faith. So just tell us a little bit about kind of the passion and purpose of your life, if you would.
This was not something that I'd ever really envisioned. At the time when I was 17 years old, actually, that I got accepted into medical school. I had originally intended to become a family practitioner, but ended up going into child psychiatry specifically because, in part, I was really disturbed by the level of care that I saw that people were getting when I was doing my rotations in medical school, and thought that specifically this was an area where I could make a big difference. And it was also an area where I felt that I could become truly expert. One of the challenges that our primary care physicians face is that they need to know a little bit about an awful lot of different things. And, something about my makeup, when I have somebody in front of me or when I have a family in front of me, it's important for me to know that I really feel like I'm competent and I'm the authority and that I'm giving them the best that anybody could possibly give them.
Sure.
And so that, the field of child psychiatry was also specific enough that I felt like I could have a pretty good handle on what's going on and, get to the point in terms of my knowledge and understanding and to be able to keep up with it, to feel like I'm reasonably expert.
Yeah, absolutely. I always appreciate reading your blogs and what you write because you're an expert on it. And I don't have to worry about the filter, who's this guy? Why does he think he can say this or whatever? I think that's so important. And the church desperately needs the message that you and Key Ministry are all about. Tell us specifically about Key Ministry.
Key Ministry has been around now for a little more than 15 years.
Yep.
And if I were to point to a specific time when the need became apparent, probably a little over 20 years ago, I was at the time a very young elder sitting in an elder board meeting at our church. Our church had had a number of very faithful and committed families in the mid-1990s who went over to Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain and adopted kids from orphanages in Russia and Bulgaria who had been pretty severely neglected and traumatized. Kids with some pretty complicated emotional and developmental disorders. And Libby Peterson, who was our children's ministry director at the time, came to one of our board meetings and was talking about some of the steps that our church was taking to be able to, support and care for these families, because one of things that they found after they brought these children back home is that these folks were having a very hard time being able to maintain their involvement at church, specifically because some of the issues that they were dealing with was very hard for them to be able to bring them to a worship service, to involve them in
Sure.
Sunday school, or to be able to find childcare for the parents to continue to be involved in, say, like their small groups or other ministries or service activities. So I'm listening to Libby talk about this at this board meeting, involving these families from our church. And at the time, and I still do, was running a fairly large child psychiatry group practice. I started thinking, like, I wonder how much of an issue this is for like the kids and families that we see on a day-to-day basis in our practice, where like the kinds of things that we would treat would be, kids with anxiety, kids with ADHD, kids with depression, bipolar disorder, other sorts of mood disorders, kids on the high end of the autism spectrum who oftentimes have comorbid mental health issues that go along with that. And without like doing anything formal or organizing it like a research study, I just started surveying families over the next few months about what their experiences at church had been like. And I was floored by some of the things that I'd heard.
Oh, I bet.
And it wasn't just kids who were coming back with what we traditionally think about as having, special needs, like kids on the deep end of the autism spectrum who are nonverbal, kids with like serious intellectual and developmental disabilities where the families were having a hard time. These relatively common kinds of conditions that we would see in the kids who are being served by our practice were a big challenge for families being able to connect with church too. And as God would have it, it's fascinating, like looking back at sort of the path that he laid out, some of the doors that were open. Around the same time, that involved with some clinical research that became very, very popular. And for about a 5 or 6 year time, I was probably the busiest speaker and lecturer in the country in my field as a result of some of this research that we've been involved with. So that when I would like travel around the country and I'd be speaking to physician groups, or we would be doing like grand rounds at a hospital or some sort of lecture, one of the things that I always try to mention in our introduction was a little bit about some of the work that our church in suburban Cleveland was doing to try to support kids and families who are struggling with what we call quote unquote hidden disability, emotional, behavioral, developmental, or neurologic condition where there weren't outwardly apparent physical symptoms. And so I started talking about this. Other people who were coming to these medical lectures recognized the need. And our church started getting inundated with requests. How Key Ministry came about. Our mission statement has been tweaked a couple of times since we were started back in 2002. Basically, what our charge is that we work to connect churches and families who have kids with disabilities for the purpose of making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we have special interest in kids with hidden disabilities. Kids and families are affected by mental health issues, trauma, kids with developmental disorders without intellectual disabilities, I think are some areas where God has like uniquely positioned us to be able to, speak into the need and to serve the worldwide church.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I don't know of any other group that does what you guys do.
15 years since we got started, there have been a number of ministries that have come along that do a wonderful job of supporting churches and caring for kids with quote-unquote special needs. So that, the Johnny and Friends ministry, which, traditionally done a lot of work with folks with physical disabilities, has really developed some wonderful resources to help churches serve kids with more severe forms of autism. You take a look at ministries like Nathaniel's Hope and 99 Balloons, that there are some great ministries now that are nationwide ministries and international ministries to help churches to be able to provide respite care to families who have kids with severe disabilities. And there are several wonderful mental health ministries, including the one that you folks have through Fresh Hope, that help to be able to care for and support Christians who are struggling with mental illness once they're inside the church. But I think that the part of what we do that's really unique, and I have a pastor friend who thought that I was called to be an evangelist, is that part of what we're about really is helping the church to be able to reach families that are affected by mental illness, because we know that that there are a lot of things that interfere with them being able to be part of the church. And our job's to make disciples. And we feel that the best way of doing that is by connecting folks up with churches that have been specifically, established and resourced by God for that specific purpose. So that part of how we would view our model is that, it's the church's job to engage in discipleship. It's our job to make the introduction and to come alongside the church and help them to be able to understand some of the unique needs of, children and adults and families that are impacted by mental illness, so that they can more effectively minister with them.
And heaven knows that this is desperately needed in the church at large, and getting the word out that the church has the hope that people need. We just need to know how to communicate it to people and share with them the hope in spite of their hidden disabilities. The thing that I think is interesting, I think you posted something on Facebook the other day about that there's 25 million people or more that stay away from the church because they think the church isn't going to welcome them due to their mental illness. Is that correct?
Well, there was an interesting survey that was done a couple of years ago by the folks at Lifeway Research.
Yes.
And they were surveying adults, both Christians and non-Christians, looking at perceptions about the church and mental illness. And one of the things that they had found in their survey was that 55% of adults who don't regularly attend church perceive that the church would not be a welcoming place for individuals and families who are affected by mental illness. And so when you start to crunch the numbers and you realize that probably 20% of kids and 25% of adults in the United States will experience symptoms of a significant mental health condition during 2018, we're talking about an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges that goes along with this is that, as somebody who works with kids, if it's mom or if it's dad that's struggling with a mental illness that interferes with them being able to go to church, there's a very good possibility that the entire family will miss out on the opportunity of being connected to church. So it doesn't just impact the 20 to 25% of people who may be experiencing symptoms of a mental illness in the moment. It impacts all of their loved ones and their immediate family and their extended family.
Absolutely.
It's too big of a population and too great a need for our churches to ignore.
And the church is very good about, if mom had cancer, there'd probably be all kinds of support because people seem to know what to do then, and they'll step in and, can I take the kids to Sunday school for you, or can we do this or do that, and food and all kinds of transportation help and all of that. But if mom has depression, people don't always react the same way, right, in the church?
Well, that's exactly right. One of our most popular blog posts, I believe it was in 2016, was entitled, "We Had No Casseroles."
Yep.
And so there were a group of parents who were being interviewed for a segment on the mental health crisis in kids by 60 Minutes. And one of the mothers in the group specifically commented that when her teenage daughter had a broken leg and was admitted to the hospital for surgery, that they talked about the wonderful care and support that they received from the local church, and that their food ministry provided casseroles to the family every night, while they were visiting their daughter in the hospital. Well, 6 months later, when their daughter was readmitted to the psychiatric unit in the hospital with depression and after having made a serious suicide attempt by overdose, there were no casseroles. And so that, oftentimes, and, it may be because of stigma, it may be because of a lack of understanding on the part of the church, that the families who are struggling with these kinds of issues don't typically get the kind of care and support for mental illness from their local churches that oftentimes they would receive if their child or if their loved one had a physical illness.
Right, right. Absolutely. Interestingly enough, let's go back to the idea that you guys connect the family with the church in an evangelistic way, let's say. Interestingly enough, when I started Fresh Hope here in Omaha, it's almost 9 years ago now, what happened was we started the group here at our church, and within 3 months, our worship attendance increased by 110%. I can say that it was a direct result of reaching people that were not being reached. It goes way back to this discipleship principle that I learned way back in the church growth movement, and that is if you meet a need in your community that is not being met, people will show up because they're desperate for that need to be met. I always believed that, but I saw it with my own eyes, and I thought, oh, wow, I think there's a need out there. And I can't imagine how many millions of people, families and kids, they're not connected with the local church, and they desperately need it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that our ministry has been working on, and this is something that I think has been desperately needed, is that there are a number of well-developed models, for example, for how people or how churches might organize or develop a special needs ministry. There really isn't a model that churches can follow for developing an intentional and purposeful outreach and evangelism strategy to people in their community that are affected by mental illness. So that's one of the things that we've been working on over the last couple of years, and one of the things that basically we put forth in the new book that you referred to.
Yes, tell us about that.
Our conversation.
Yeah.
So that one of the things that we specifically talk about in the book, among the 7 different strategies that churches might consider pursuing or incorporating into a broader mental health inclusion strategy, is doing exactly what your mission is at Fresh Hope, which is providing mental health education and support, to the surrounding community, and, helping to provide care and support for folks, in the surrounding community who are struggling with significant mental health concerns. Because, having Fresh Hope groups and promoting it in the local community is basically putting out a welcome mat to folks. And I think that that's one of the things that, that you and your church experienced, in Omaha when you started running the groups, and one of the things that, a number of the churches who are doing Fresh Hope groups now have experienced.
It is like a welcome mat. Let's talk about your book. Tell us the title and when it's coming out. For some of you that are listening to the podcast, it'll be out by the time you listen. And so give us the lowdown on it.
Well, the title of the book is Mental Health in the Church. It is being published by Zondervan. It will be available at all of the usual online sites and hopefully in Christian bookstores everywhere on February 6th. But the book's currently available at the time of our conversation for pre-order. And essentially what we're doing in the book is that we're putting forth this model for mental health inclusion strategy. But we don't just think that it's going to be something that's going to be helpful specifically for pastors and church leaders, but there are lots of insights in the book that we try to share about some of the challenges that children and adults with mental illness experience because of certain attributes associated with their mental illness that may have a negative impact in terms of their spiritual growth and development. So I would think that this book would be something that would also be useful to a parent of a child with a mental health issue, grandparents, adoptive and foster parents who are, caring for kids with mental health issues or trauma, and, anyone who loves someone with a mental illness and hopes to be able to share their faith with them. And so that, so again, that there's lots of useful information, but basically the core of the book is to outline how a church might organize like the way that they would approach, welcoming, including, and ministering to families with mental illness, and including them in like all of the different types of activities that we do at church that are most critical for making disciples.
Mm-hmm. I'm so excited because when I read the book, I thought this is the kind of book that every leader needs to read in the church, the local church, that denominational leaders need to read, but also grandpa and grandmas with grandchildren that have special, disabilities with mental health, or however you say it the correct way, and moms and dads. I mean, it's really a great resource for everybody. If you're a pastor and you're listening to this podcast today, I hope you know this is a book you should be getting. You really should pre-order it. Give us the title again, Steve.
Well, the title of the book, again, is Mental Health in the Church. And basically the way that the book is organized is that we talk about like 7 different barriers that oftentimes interfere with individuals and families impacted by mental illness being able to attend church. And then we lay out 7 different strategies that church leaders might pursue or might implement across their different areas of ministry to be able to welcome and include them. So one of the important points I'd also like to share about the book is that we did this very purposely in such a way so that it's more of a way of thinking or a strategy as opposed to something that would represent like a standalone program or ministry that a church would attempt. Because we want folks in every area of ministry thinking about how they can welcome and minister more effectively to folks with mental illness.
Yep.
And one of the things that's really critical and why there needed to be a different approach to this as opposed to, say, like special needs ministry is that, my experience with kids and families who have struggled with this is that they desperately want to be like everybody else. And they want to be able to do all of the kinds of things and participate in the types of activities that everybody else wants to participate in. And they want to do so without calling attention to themselves.
Yes.
So that some of the best things that we do to support folks through a mental health inclusion strategy are also going to be techniques and strategies and approaches that are going to help everybody in general in the local church. And we try to develop a model that would work for the mega church, with 10,000 plus people and multiple campuses, as well as sort of like the small church with, 25 to 50 people meeting on Sunday. So that we think that the model's flexible enough that it should work for folks with any denominational tradition in churches of any size, in churches with any type of organizational structure.
And I could say that you hit that mark, you hit that goal. I had the privilege to read a manuscript of the book, and I got to tell you, I thought you hit that very well. And it's the kind of book that it doesn't matter what size your church is or whatever. If I was the pastor of a church that had a staff, I would have everybody on the staff read the book. And I'd have my leaders read it, because it's the kind of thing then you can start to process these 7 things and look at them. And it's kind of reminds me of a book I read years ago by Callahan on the 12 keys to an effective church ministry. And what our staff did is we went through each of those things. And I could see easily staff being able to work through the 7 things that you list. And where do we have barriers? How can we change this? Because this is not, if somebody's wheelchair bound, okay, we need to get a wheelchair ramp. These are hidden things. And so there has to be a change of mind and a change of heart, right? In dealing with families?
Absolutely.
Or more understanding.
Yeah, here, I'll give you a couple of examples. In that, like, one of the most common, like, mental health conditions seen among adults is social anxiety.
Yes.
We're talking about something that affects maybe 6 to 7% of the population. So that, like, imagine this scenario for a minute if you're a church leader. Like, let's say there's a family that lives down the street from your church where you have maybe a single mom with two kids, ages 12 and 9. The 9-year-old son is totally neurotypical, gets invited to vacation Bible school by one of his friends, loves it, wants to come to church every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that the mom has social anxiety and agoraphobia, and the 12-year-old sister has separation anxiety. Someone with social anxiety, one of the things that they struggle with is that oftentimes they overestimate the level of risk entering into a new situation.
Yep.
And they may tend to have lots of misperceptions in terms of like how they're viewed by other people.
Mm-hmm.
How many folks is that mom going to have to talk to the first Sunday she comes to visit your church? So there'll be greeters at the door. She might need to register her son for children's ministry and her daughter for middle school ministry.
Mm-hmm.
She needs to be able to find where to go. What if the family's going to a church where it's expected that, the kids are supposed to be in their age-appropriate ministry activities, and what happens if the daughter starts becoming anxious at the prospect of being separated from mom in an unfamiliar place? Yeah. What happens to mom if, again, she's prone to panic attacks and there isn't an available seat near an exit or a door where if she starts to experience intense symptoms of anxiety, she can slip out quietly without drawing a lot of attention to herself? And again, we're talking about something that, again, it's a relatively common condition.
Right.
And the nature of a lot of these mental health conditions and why it's, I think, hard at times for the church or church leaders to get their heads around this is that one of the things about mental health disabilities is that people can be disabled some but not all of the time and in some but not all environments. Mm-hmm. So that mom may in fact be very successful and be very capable in the context of her job during the week. But there are specific things about, for example, like the nature of like our culture in the church and the way that we do ministry and the environments in which we do ministry that may, again, with us being unaware as church leaders, create really significant challenges for folks with common mental health.
Absolutely. Those of you who have a mental health issue or your loved one might, give this podcast, send this podcast to your church leaders. Send it to your pastor. Ask him to listen to it. Normally at this point, I would have our guest speak to people who have mental health challenges. I'm going to ask you to do something different, Steve. If you would speak to a church leader, to the elder, to Sunday school teachers, to, the lay leaders, to the pastor, encouraging them to understand that there's really stuff they can do.
Well, Brett, thanks for that opportunity. And I can definitely empathize because, in addition to leading our ministry, I've, served on the board of like 2 different churches, like over the last 30 years. And one of the challenges as a church leader is that there are lots and lots of competing priorities and all kinds of worthy ministries, and oftentimes like very limited resources in terms of, in terms of like money and in terms of volunteers.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would share with them is that this is not necessarily the kind of ministry where you're going to have to spend a lot in the way of money and have to spend a lot in the way of resources. Mm-hmm. And this is a ministry that can very much be owned by the people of your church.
Yep.
That the responsibility for this type of ministry needs to rest not necessarily with the church leaders or to put one more thing on their plate, but a really effective mental health inclusion strategy is going to, involve empowering the people of your church to be the church in the various places, the workplace, their schools, within the context of their friendship and social networks, to be able to, to where God has positioned them, to reach people and, and to share the love of Christ with people who definitely need to hear that message and to experience that love. Yeah. And I would also encourage them to think that, because this is so common and it's something that affects 20% of kids and 25% of adults, in your surrounding community that your church, has been positioned to serve, that this is potentially a very high impact ministry.
Yes, it is.
For being able to reach the gospel. And these are not folks where you have to send a mission team out, to Central America or South America or Africa. They're literally living within the shadow of your steeple right now.
Yeah.
And a good mental health inclusion strategy empowers the people of your church to be the church and to reach out to and include kids, families, colleagues, co-workers, and welcome them to be a part of your church, after you've taken the time to think through and work around and accommodate people for, some of the potential barriers and challenges that would get in the way of them being a part of your church and being a part of the activities that go on at your church that are most critical for helping people to become followers of Jesus.
Absolutely. Amen to everything you just said. And pastor, if you're an elder or whoever you might be listening to this, please, please, please go to Amazon.com or wherever you buy your books online and type in Mental Health and the Church by Dr. Steve Grcevich. Don't ask me to spell his last name because I'd have to start speaking in tongues in order to do it. Find that book, order it, and trust me, it will be well worth you reading and to begin thinking about this. I know it can seem overwhelming. I pastor a small church, and I've pastored a big church. And in a big church, sometimes it's not as overwhelming because you can hand it off to somebody on the staff. But if you're in a church that's small like ours, it's something I would need to absorb into my being and assimilate. Steve has done it in such a way in this book that it will be easy to process through, and it won't seem so complicated when you start doing it through there with the 7 barriers and then the 7 inclusion strategies. It really is written in a way that I felt like, gosh, this is easy to think about in regards to it as Steve laid it out. So, and it's not because I want to help Steve sell books. That's really not why I'm saying go to Amazon. I'm saying this because I know as a result of your reading the book, it will help you reach people that are not being reached in your community for Christ. And at the same time, it will give them a safe place to come and come in such a way that doesn't make them feel less than. So, Steve, I really think... Go ahead.
If I could just share 2 things to follow that up.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we're going to have available on our Key Ministry website is a free downloadable planning tool for churches.
Oh, excellent.
So that if you go to like keyministry.org and it'll be /mental health in the church, one of the things that folks are going to be able to download for free is specifically a planning guide, so that it walks through every different area of church ministry in terms of children's ministry, student ministry, adult ministries, your worship team, your communications team, your facilities management team, with specific questions to think about and specific ideas for each one of those ministry teams to be able to overcome the barriers that exist.
Oh, yeah,
and then one of the things that we're also going to be giving church leaders an opportunity to do after the book comes out is that I am going to be doing a series of conferences on Zoom to basically, it'll be a book study, so that we'll walk alongside church leaders who are interested.
Oh, wow.
And have them, give them opportunities to be able to network with other folks who are trying to use the book and walk through chapter by chapter and help them to be able to, to give them some ideas or to give them some encouragement, support specifically if they have questions about the book or need help in terms of being able to implement the strategy. And so that if folks, follow us at, keyministry.org, /mental health in the church, they'll be able to find that, and they'll be able to find lots of other resources, including links to help them start up Fresh Hope groups.
Wow. We've got to get the word out about this. So go to keyministry.org /mental health and the church. And that tool alone is something that's desperately needed for churches, because that research that you were talking about a while ago with Lifeway, it showed that most churches are doing nothing and don't know what to do. So thank God for that. Would you mind doing me a favor and just praying for churches, for leaders, and for the families that they've yet to connect with, and asking God to make those connections in the communities? Would you mind?
Certainly. Heavenly Father, thanks so much for, giving us this opportunity, and for, Pastor Brad using his platform, to be able to share the good news that Jesus has for, families who have been impacted by mental illness. Thank you so much for just the way that you're placing this need on the hearts and minds of so many different leaders in, different disciplines with different connections to the church around the country and around the world. I'd ask that, you would help us to be able to collaborate with one another, fill us with your Spirit, and help, all who are called to respond to this need to demonstrate your love in serving and supporting churches and serving and supporting families, so that every member of the family can come to know you, come to grow in faith with you, and then use their gifts and talents that you intended to be able to build your kingdom. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much for your time, Steve. I just appreciate it greatly. I'm appreciating your friendship, and the ministry of keyministry.org is fabulous. You've been a good friend, and I look forward to that, many more years of that. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Brad.
My friend, we want to thank you for listening to this podcast. And I hope and I pray that you will take it. If you're not a church leader, send it to your church leader. And if you're a pastor, if you're a leader, be sure and download the resources. Buy the book, get it, and read it. And for those of you who are out there who are not connected to a church, trust me, we're attempting to challenge the church at large so that you might be able to find a safe place locally. If, for instance, you are not finding that place and you need connection, connect with us through Fresh Hope or connect with keyministry.org. And we would love to hear from you, questions you have, input that you have. Just write me at Pastor Brad at freshhope.us, Pastor Brad at freshhope.us. And I encourage you to connect with Key Ministry on social media, Twitter, and all those places. You can find Dr. Steve. You can find us on that. There's videos. There's all kinds of resources. I want you to know that you are not alone, and that there is hope. And there is healing. And if you want, and if you wish, we'd love to connect with you in any way possible. If you do need group support, and there's not a Fresh Hope group in your area or your city, or a Grace Alliance group in your area or your city, we do have online groups, and you can go to our website and find out about that. Be sure to tell your friends about this podcast. And until next time, may the Lord fill you with his hope, fresh and new daily. I'm Brad Hafes, your host, and this has been another edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
Thank you for listening to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. If you have an opportunity, please review, share, and subscribe to the Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast on iTunes or on the service that you use. We encourage you to share our podcast on social media with your friends and family. Previous podcasts of Fresh Hope for Mental Health can be found at freshhopeformentalhealth.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. Fresh Hope is one of the leading networks of faith-based peer support groups internationally. For more information about Fresh Hope, go to freshhope.us.